Okay, I'm going to talk, I hope not too long, maybe for about 35 to 40 minutes. I'd like to leave time for you to ask questions and just for us to talk. So just to begin, the lecture is called Caste Studies in Following the Equator. This year's Trouble at 8 lecture series, following on the recent focus of the Mark Twain Center on Abolition Studies, is for me a chance to reopen some of my work on Twain in what Joe described as my 2020 book, Blood Talk, subtitled American Race Melodrama and the Culture of the Occult. And it might not seem like it has a connection immediately to Following the Equator, but I'll try to make good on that. And then in turn, this is about caste studies. Today's academic work on what's sometimes called critical caste studies, together with its social movement counterpart. The many calls in the US and the UK to try to make caste a protected category provide a perfect context, I think, for rethinking Twain's own work in one of his more understudied books, and that is Following the Equator, published in 1897. It's a travel narrative, and perhaps an unlikely source of his lifelong thinking on slavery and freedom, blackness and whiteness. It's kind of a surprising late 19th century US literary example of comparative caste thinking. Now, no one would have said that about it, but I'm presenting it, hoping to convince you that it is a kind of manifesto, or at least meditation, on comparative caste thinking. And then I also would like to try very briefly at the end to talk about the potential relevance of that Twain book to today's anti-casteism, as it's called, and broadly anti-racism. So turning to that historical moment of his 14-month around-the-world lecture tour in the 1890s, when, forced by bankruptcy, he had to, as he said very famously, crucify himself nightly on the lecture platform. As he says in a letter to his agent, James Redpath, in 1870, that letter had been written much earlier in Elmira, right after his marriage, so much earlier than Following the Equator. But that moment puts Twain's semi-forgotten account of that trip on the front burner. And here, I just want you to see, I put together just a couple of slides so you could see a bunch of different editions across time. So I'll just move forward. I'll go back to a couple of these at the very end. They really stress the illustrations, these editions. Whoever the booksellers are tend to bring out, or the publishers, focus on the illustrations. So I'm going to eventually go back to that. So readers of this wonderful travel narrative followed Twain's equator to Honolulu and the Fiji Islands, Sydney and Melbourne, Tasmania, Ceylon, Bombay, Calcutta, Cape Town, and Johannesburg. It's toward the middle of this narrative, along what he called the globe-girdling belt. The equator is the globe-girdling belt, sometimes the hot belt of the equator. And it's around the middle of the narrative, the globe-girdling belt of this narrative, when Twain makes an extended series of comparisons between his own antebellum slavery past in the US South and the imperial present in what's called today the global South, which is all of the underdeveloped places around the world that have southern facing locations or southernmost locations. So India would be one of them. A key moment for thinking about Twain as a caste race comparatist, that would be the equation between caste in India and race in the US, comes in chapter 38, so about in the middle of the book. Here's another, two more pictures of the early ones, several of the editions. Here's chapter 38, and I am using a lot of these slides just so you can get a feel for what the book is like, what it looked like, what the illustrations are like. the pages are set up, and I'll read things to you, but you don't need to worry. I tried to point out where on the page, I'm reading from, just to give you just to make you more active readers or listeners. So it opens with an unforgettable description of Bombay. January 20th, Bombay, exclamation point. A bewitching place, a bewildering place, an enchanting place. The Arabian Nights come again. It is a vast city, contains about 1 million inhabitants. Natives they are, with a slight sprinkling of white people, not enough to have the slightest modifying effect upon the massed, dark complexion of the public. This turns out to be a very multi-layered act of memory, written later, but you can see as though it's a diary entry with the January 20th. So as though a diary entry. So they're nominally what a lot of the chapters consist of, these from a diary. It switches between past and present tense in the way that a journal entry might also. It is winter yet. Even now, after the lapse of a year, the delirium of those days in Bombay has not left me. And India did not wait for morning. It began at the hotel, straight away. So Twain compares the socio-political and economic injustices of the caste system in India, which he sees dramatized before him in that Bombay hotel, to his own personal memories of his boyhood in the US South. This is indeed India, the land of dream and romance. I just sort of want you to hear this is simultaneously something very attractive to him and something disturbing. The land of dream and romance, but also, and I'm not going to give it here, but of fabulous wealth, of bond and free, genie and giants and Aladdin's lamps, the country of 100 nations and 100 tongues, of 1,000 religions and 2 million gods, cradle of the human race, birthplace of human speech. So 2 of those are about language. The 100 tongues, birthplace of human speech, mother of history, grandmother of legend, great-grandmother of tradition. So Twain, in this very beginning of this chapter, puts his own, what I would call occult, and it's partly from my interest in the culture of the occult, his own occult and what's sometimes called an orientalist stamp on India, the mother and home of that wonder of wonders, caste, as he writes later, which in a passage I'll come to next. Here, it functions as a conduit to the race and class divisions of Twain's America. This orientalist, occult India does function as an actual political conduit, I think, to the race and class divisions of Twain's America. And from there, speculatively, I'm going to hope to show, to today's critical caste studies. Now, so here, I have slides on what is Twain's occultism. He was interested biographically, personally, long-term, in various kinds of what we would call kind of psychic phenomena or spiritual phenomena. They called them that too. Thought transference, dreams, seances. After Susie died, his oldest daughter Susie died, he is said to have become interested in the idea of mediumistic communication with the dead. He has this connection to the broad turn of the century interest in, again, what was called psychic phenomena. The psychologist and philosopher William James was very interested in mediumship. He interviewed this medium, Mrs. Piper, and thought of her as a white crow, the exception to the rule of the frauds among mediums. So Twain and these are other examples. I just wanted to give you a couple of ones that you might have heard of this interest in the culture of the occult in late 19th century United States. Twain's biographical details for it are these few. I just brought up a couple of things. In 1884, he became a member of the British Society for Psychical Research, which William James was also a member of. 1889, Connecticut Yankee, time travel. interest, that's another one of his interests in occultism, which we'll see, of course, in Following the Equator, even though it's an actual travel narrative. He wrote a piece, an essay called Mental Telegraphy in the 1880s, and it wasn't published until 1895. So Mental Telegraphy, it spans his, this long, almost 20-year period. And then most people know about, in the very latter part of his life, he wrote the Mysterious Stranger manuscripts, which are about also this occult connection between 1490 Austria and his own contemporary place in 19th century United States. And then there were other works like that, which was The Dream and other symbolic of the writings of the later years. Those were all published in the 1960s and 70s. So this spans quite a long time. I wanted you just to see, here's the piece on mental telegraphy that was published in Harper's Monthly in September 1895. So I made this discovery, and you can see the dates really matter when he's talking, when he recalls these memories or recalls this work. I made this discovery 16 or 17 years ago and gave it a name, mental telegraphy. It's the same thing around the outer edges of which the Psychical Society of England began to grope and play with 4 or 5 years ago, and which they named telepathy. And so here, I just want you to see, it's a really interesting description of his discovery of what he calls mental telegraphy. In this old manuscript, I'm just reading from the bottom paragraph, you will find mention of an extraordinary experience of mine in the mental telegraphic line of date about the year 1874 to 75. So it goes back, his interest in mental telegraphy or thought transference goes all the way back to the 1870s. And that piece goes back to something that he wrote when he was out in the, as a reporter in the 1860s. It was this experience that called my attention to the matter under consideration. I began to keep a record after that of such experiences of mind as seemed explicable by the theory that minds telegraph thoughts to each other. Then he went to Germany, started to write the book called A Tramp Abroad, interestingly another travel narrative. He removed it. It was put in the appendix in A Tramp Abroad for fear the public would treat the thing as a joke and throw it aside, whereas I was in earnest. That's Twain's occultism, and you'll see the connection to Following the Equator. The Orientalist, this is just really quickly, this is a very well-known Palestinian scholar, Edward Said, who wrote a book called Orientalism, and you'll see, this slide I think gives a better sense. It's a phenomenon constructed by generations of intellectuals, artists, and politicians who were interested in thinking about, in the second part of this, the Orientalist discourse as a sign of the power exerted by the West over the East, rather than as a true or false, don't take discourse about the Orient. And I think here's one way to put it. It is, rather than expresses, a will or intention to understand, and in some cases to control or manipulate, what is a manifestly different world. So we can try to think about Twain's Orientalism and what is it. So I put together 3 slides. I won't look at them, but they all, and I can actually, Joe has the slides, so you can certainly look at them. There are many places in Following the Equator where he talks about Aladdin's lamps, the genies, the oriental splendor of Following the Equator. It is he is thinking orientally and orientalistly, and I hope just that we can talk about how he's doing that. I was in Cairo years ago. That was oriental, but there was a lack. When you're in Florida or New Orleans, you're in the South. That is great. So the Cairo was a tempered Orient. Often this Orientalism makes him think of the US or of the comparison between the US. Here's another one. He's interested here, he's talking about your long ago dreams of India arising. So there's again this dream work, the interest in dreams as part of this Orientalism or occultism. So I'm just thinking of Twain as an occult Orientalist, Orientalist occultist. Either way you want to put them first, and that is hardly what you would normally think of when you read this travel narrative. You know, I went in the steamer Calcutta from X to Y, but he turns it into this. So here, what he's interested in are these wild titles of all the princes of many princes across India, and he's using these different names as part of his interest in the languages of India. So here, and as always, there's a lot of numbers for Twain. He's interested in quantifying. Indeed, it's a country that runs richly to name. The great god Vishnu has 108 special ones, names for Sunday just only. So Sunday use only. So here, this is just an example of the way he links language to this Orientalist view of India. And then here's another one. I'll talk more. Here's just so you can see one of the illustrations. Just then, into this dream of fairyland and paradise, a grating dissonance was injected. Out of a missionary school came marching 2 and 2, 16 prim and pious little Christian black girls, Europeanly clothed, and then see how he immediately thinks of the comparison to America, dressed to the last detail as they would have been dressed on a summer Sunday in an English or American village. How ugly, unspeakably ugly, and I want to sort of try to get to the conclusions that he draws about what's also very humorous, and it's both part of. So I looked at my women's folks' clothes, just full-grown duplicates of the outrages disguising those poor little abused creatures, and that's the caption for this illustration by one of the 11 artists who illustrated the 200 illustrations of the narrative. So here is our next, to get to this occultist, Orientalist connection to the United States, or between India and the United States, Twain summons that very occult power that he calls mental telegraphy in that Harper's Weekly article. It turns up only a few chapters earlier than where I first started. This is chapter 34, and it seems a very unexpected, unrelated, out of nowhere, in a conversation, as he says, that he's having with his wife, Livy. And here it is. This is just the description. Everywhere that there was an illustration, I made sure to put it in somewhere. But this is just, this is what it looks like. They're at a dinner table, talking, quote, about poetry and cabbage and art. You know, that sounds just like of Mark Twain, when sparked by some framed pictures on the wall that he fancies, he says, depict the murder of Napoleon III's son by Zulus in South Africa, an actual event. So he thinks mistakenly, sparked by these pictures, he thinks mistakenly that he remembers the news of that event, the murder of the prince, that they had heard much earlier on another trip in Paris. Both he and she, though, it turns out, misremember the same mistaken memory. They both remember, but it's a misremembering of the same mistaken memory. Here was a clear case of mental telegraphy, of mind transference, of my mind telegraphing a thought into hers. How do I know? Because I telegraphed an error. See, this is like looking William James on Mrs. Piper. How can I prove the existence of thought transference? Because I telegraphed an error. She had to get the error from me. It existed nowhere else. A mere 4 chapters after this, we get another instance where he brings up the power of mental telegraphy to do what he calls later annihilating space-time, and to bring him all the way back to his Missouri slave past. It is a classic, what I would think of as classic Twainian space-time continuum between his US South past and the equatorial present. And here is the facing where I'm going to read. This is the illustration facing the page that I'm going to read. The trigger for this memory is it's a racialized connection to his past. The orientalized, I'm just calling it that because now you know what that's alluding to. It's the orientalized sight that he recounts of a turbaned, dark native servant who's dressed for a part in the Arabian Nights, one of the 14 who followed. Right here, a procession of native servants who he sees, and it triggers this memory for him of this turbaned, dark servant being given what he calls, and again, this is all from the other side of the page, being given a brisk cuff on the jaw by a white man. I'm reading right from this. By a white man, a burly German, that he witnesses. So it's this beating that it's this servant who brings him back to that memory, and it's the site at the Bombay Hotel. I had not seen the like of this, he continues, for 50 years. It carried me back to my boyhood and flashed upon me the forgotten fact that this was the usual way of explaining one's desires to a slave. I was able to remember that the method seemed right and natural to me in those days, I being born to it. But I was also able to remember that those cuffings made me sorry for the victim and ashamed for the punisher. Now, who was the punisher? None other than Clemens's father. But here, rather than demonize the father as he does, you'll remember Huck Finn's abusive father in Huck Finn. But rather than demonize the father as he does with Pap, Finn, and elsewhere, he cultivates, what I think we could think of as the more forgiving cultural relativism induced by travel. His father, he writes, was a refined and kindly gentleman who, however, quote, had passed his life amongst the slaves from the cradle up, and his cuffings proceeded from the custom of the time, not his nature. Custom of the time brings up Twain's novel Pudd'nhead Wilson, which is also from this period of the 1890s, where he talks about race as a fiction of law and custom, Pudd'nhead Wilson. And of course, you've seen, I don't know if you can remember, but you will see Pudd'nhead Wilson's new calendar, which is Twain's from the epigraphs to these chapters. So there's interconnection among all of this work of this late Twain period, which I think is the most fascinating one for him. Twain concludes this long meditation on that shared birthright of the father and the son, with a salute to the thrill of mental travel across space-time. Here it is. It is curious, the space-annihilating power of thought for just 1 second. And so think about the time, space and time annihilation. For just 1 second, all that goes to make the me in me was in a Missourian village on the other side of the globe, vividly seeing again those forgotten pictures of 50 years ago. And in the next second, I was back in Bombay, and that kneeling native's smitten cheek was not done tingling yet. Back to boyhood, 50 years, back to age again, another 50, and in a flight equal to the circumference of the globe, all in 2 seconds by the watch. The sheer exuberance, it's a wonderful passage about mental telegraphy in the most surprising place following the equator. The sheer exuberance of that passage, which nearly counterbalances the pain of the memory. And just so, in the same way, time traveling from within the occult sphere of mental telegraphy enables the recovery of the past, which is so marked by conflict and guilt, as well as dreamy nostalgia and a retreat from it all, and a retreat from the past. So recovery of and retreat from the past is enabled by this occult power. That oscillation from the dream vision of the Missouri village, which is itself a source of both pleasure and anxiety, to the reality of Bombay, itself divided between both the exoticism and the otherness of the racialized Orient, enacts the central rhythm of following the equator. It's that back and forth between past and present, between pleasure and something painful. Travel along the equatorial black belt means movement across space and time, just as we saw, but also across languages. So I've already started with showing you a little bit about the princely titles, one of the places that he pays attention to language. And that passage that I read to you in the very beginning from Bombay, where he counts the number of languages that are part of the birthplace of human speech, which is India. So I think all of this looks backwards. The mental telegraphy portion of Following the Equator looks backward to so much of Twain's earlier life, and then forward to some of Twain's other adjacent work on caste, where there is others. There's quite a bit of other work. One is caste as it applies to the Chinese, the Jews. Here's from, again, 1899. Won't go into it, but he thinks about Southerners and caste in Connecticut Yankee. He thinks about the English and caste in Life on the Mississippi, 1883, and Connecticut Yankee is 1889. There's a lot of really interesting work, quotations on it. And he also thinks about language in adjacent places to caste. He's interested in dialects in Huck Finn. That's very well known. But also, he talks about, he has a very well-known essay that people love the title of but don't look at, called The Awful German Language, 1880, also part of A Tramp Abroad. Then that number, one of those mysterious stranger manuscripts is entitled this way, number 44, The Mysterious Stranger, being an ancient tale found in a jug and freely translated from the jug. That book, it's really just wonderful, right? Mysterious, number 44, The Mysterious Stranger, being an ancient tale found in a jug and freely translated from the jug. It's filled with scenes of translation. Cat language, as he calls it, cat talk, that's number 44, The Mysterious Stranger. Again, an adjacent work to Following the Equator. Twain is, what I'm trying to suggest, a caste thinker, a philosopher of translation, and a historical comparativist. Briefly, I'm always trying to contextualize to give you a sense of, well, what else was happening around Twain, like the occultism. So let's briefly put this caste-saturated Twain in broader late 19th century US cultural context. I tried to show you quickly the occult culture. Here's the caste, the small references to caste in 19th century literature. So here's Frederick Douglass uses the term caste in this really interesting British journal, Anti-Caste. Oliver, I won't go through it, but it's a really interesting publication, very short-lived, also reflects Twain's traveling and his life abroad. Twain's and Douglass's, excuse me. Oliver Wendell Holmes writes about Boston Brahmins, the Brahmin caste of New England, in his 1861 novel. So this is Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court Justice, who writes on the Brahmin caste of New England in Elsie Venner, an 1861 novel. And then really interestingly, there is a legal connection to thinking about caste, not just making it a protected legal category. This one you'll I think, really identify with. In the 1896 Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the one that enshrined segregation, the lone dissent was by Justice Harlan. It's very famous. He invoked the 19th century language of caste in his famous brief on behalf of constitutional colorblindness that Twain was very interested in even before the 1896 decision in Connecticut Yankee, the idea of justice as colorblind. And Harlan's invocation of this language of caste has been misinterpreted by current originalists, such as Samuel Alito. I mean, there are many on the Supreme Court. It's not simply Alito, but the originalists argue that he took an anti-classification position, Harlan, against the Equal Protection Clause. And that whole idea was declared unconstitutional in the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education. So this is a long-lasting question of the relationship between caste and legal thinking in the United States. Twain appears, so that's just a quick list, but Twain appears, two more, productively and generatively out of step with most of those very few contemporaries working on caste. This is my idea, that he really is not like, he isn't thinking like most of them. They tend to assume the idea of caste and race as somehow either an analogy, an equation, an equal sign, that they fit together. But he instead drills down into that equation, looking at different X factors in it, which don't look like they belong to it, like language, and trying to understand that analogy between caste and race, and possibly to debunk it, to expose it. You'll see. So here are two, I just wanted to show you more of what else was written on caste. Two popular novels serialized in the 19th and early 20th centuries by African-American women. One, The Curse of Caste, or The Slave Bride, first published by Julia Collins in 1865, and Hagar's Daughter, A Story of Southern Caste Prejudice, first published in the Colored American magazine, it was called, in 1901 too. The titles are telling. They are a perfect example of how titles, which are often called paratextual materials, they're the materials in a book that are slightly outside the actual work itself, titles, illustrations, an appendix, things that could be dropped out of the work in the next edition. So they're often places that look very important like a title, but they have a very fragile status. So here, the word caste is ultra visible at the thresholds of both texts, but each title signals symptomatically how little they actually use the term. See, they just allude to it in these important places, and that's it. Twice for Collins, if you can do a Google search on all of these online, twice the word caste is used for Collins, thrice for Hopkins. Infrequent, rare, caste is taken by them, and really I was arguing for the others as well, as a given, a kind of umbrella term for any and all aspects of the history of race in the U.S., from slavery all the way to Jim Crow prejudice. Also, the two novels, which are set across the South from Charleston, South Carolina, to New Orleans and up to Washington, D.C., place caste almost entirely in the U.S. domestic context of slavery, whereas Twain, like Douglass, to give Douglass his due, like Frederick Douglass, is an internationalist. So this is Twain, who uses the Indian context in Following the Equator to extend, analyze, and ultimately question that caste-race comparison. That's really what I think is happening with the orientalist, occultist approach to caste, which is so much still with us. That's sort of the idea. Twain was doing it, thinking about it in the 1890s. It's not to say, damn him with faint praise by saying, oh, he anticipated what we do even better. It's not that. It's something about what he's doing with his moment in 1897 with caste and what's happening in our moment with the Isabel Wilkerson book as caste, and then the Ava DuVernay film, which was made of it. So this is another moment where caste is somehow emerging in popular culture. So back to reading Twain on caste and Following the Equator. India, the birthplace on a giant scale. Here I want to, here's where I'm starting to quote. See, up at the top, and I tried to put the blue arrows just to draw your eye. This is a little later in Following the Equator, but it's close to where I was reading before. India, the birthplace on a giant scale. Again, his interest in quantification, numbers. He's of civilization, poverty, famine, disease, and the birthplace of that wonder of wonders, caste. Should have remained, he says a little later in the paragraph, maybe seemingly facetiously, a long-standing seat of empire, not the British colony that it became and that it was when he was there. So down here, but in truth, there was never any possibility of such supremacy for her. And what it is its very multiplicity, the bigness of India, the huge numbers of everything, did it in. If there had been one India and one language, but there were 80 of them, so before it was 100, here it's 80. If there had been one, and one India and one language, but there were 80 of them, even caste itself, up here, could have had the defeating effect of a multiplicity of tongues, no doubt, for it separates a people into layers and layers and still other layers. It was the division of the country into so many states and nations that made thuggee possible right here and prosperous. Thuggee, Twain's satiric term for this powerful criminal element, naturally he's joking with the way he's spelling it, but it's a powerful criminal element in Indian society, which he pretty soon shows is also a part of his own world of global empire. So it is difficult to realize the situation. What is it like in India with, instead of one language, it has the many languages. But perhaps one may approximate it. Now here's where I'm thinking that it's speculative. He's hypothesizing. One may approximate it, perhaps, by imagining the states of our union peopled by separate nations speaking different languages with guards and custom houses strung across all frontiers. It would make intercommunication in a measure ungeneral. The punchline, implicitly looking back askance to thuggee, to this Indian criminal element, in line with Twain's developing anti-imperialism, is right down here. Wait, where am I? I'm further along. Yes, here it is. India had 80 languages and more custom houses than what animal? Cats. Interested in them in terms of languages. And more custom houses than cats. No clever man with the instinct of a highway robber could fail to notice what a chance for business was here offered. How long ago that was, nobody knows. Centuries, it is supposed. One of the chiefest wonders connected with the success with which it kept it secret. So this is very much in line with To the Person Sitting in Darkness and other anti-imperial essays of the 1898 following the Spanish-American War. This is that it's a great business. We have to keep it going as a secret business and hide it from the person sitting in darkness in order for it to keep going. The English trader did business in India 200 years and more before he ever heard of it, and yet it was assassinating its thousands all around him every year, the whole time. For me, what a deeply translational thinker he is and was. He is in the sense that the books are in the present. We are reading them in our present, and was as an actual member of the 19th century society. For Twain, thinking caste comparatively requires, I think, thinking translationally. He's so interested in language as this apparently unconnected part of thinking about the caste-race equation. But strikingly, in this case, this passage, this means going well beyond the usual common understanding. I'll try it out and you can tell me if you think this. The common understanding of translation is very often, it's used just as a broad metaphor for relations between cultures, like cultural translation. Twain goes way deeper than thinking just about comparing cultures, as translating cultures, one from another into another. He zeroes in on the specifically linguistic dimension of translation in the caste context. And even more striking, he starts here in this key speculative passage, hard to approximate what it would be like in the US with many languages, but let's imagine what it would be like. Well, he doesn't start with interlingual translation. Instead, what he starts with, which is the most common form of translation, interlingual is between languages. Instead, what he starts with is what he is interested in, the intralingual, that is, within a single place or a single language. So the Indian languages as variations on a single one. He starts with the intralingual, internal differences among multiple Indian languages, whether you say there are 80 or 100. And I think this, throughout most of the following the equator, he includes English as one of the strange internal languages, now externally imposed, but now part of India, as a colonial language. And that's where I would have mentioned all those titles of the gods. Most strikingly of all, here's my punchline, and we're almost over, is that this intralingual process, which ends in that intercommunication, is in a measure ungeneral. It ends in what was called in that wonderful film, Cool Hand Luke, what we've got here is a failure to communicate. It ends in the failure to communicate. It defamiliarizes Twain's own language here. Foreignizes, to use, that's another word from translation theory. His own language is foreignized. His native language is foreignized. That's why he has this thought experiment to approximate the situation of the Indian multiplicity of languages by imagining the states of our union peopled by separate nations speaking different languages, that this imagining pushes his own English language towards something that's counterfactual. The hypothetical, the speculative, his intercommunication ungeneral goes beyond worrying about the intermediate between everything is translatable and nothing is translatable. In the middle is mistranslation, which is the one most of us worry about. Translation as not being faithful to the original, what's lost in translation. That would be, instead, he's not worried about mistranslation. Why not? Because there's no singular stable Indian origin language. So English as the translation becomes itself unmoored as the target language, the language in which something is translated. It verges, I think Twain's, the whole book, the whole idea of creating a connection between India and the US verges on, it doesn't work, it's untranslatable. They don't really fit each other. The two terms there's no equal sign between them. Put bluntly or baldly, another way to put it, is that the two-country caste, race, slavery comparison turns into a time travel route. It's hard to tell where we are in any of these places. Near the end of the lecture tour, Twain is now back writing the book. So the book that we're reading, he is writing in London, where, of course, what language is the dominant one? English, and it's the only one. There are accents, there are places that people speak from, but it's the only one that has intralingual differences. The Old English is different from modern English, but it is the dominant primary first language. Well, returning there, we might think, here's the poster, finally would have returned him to his comfort zone, to his original, to his own native language. But he swerves away from thinking at all about language or thinking textually. And instead, he swerves toward the visual as a source of thinking about difference. So orientalizing is one way to think about difference. Here, what he does is he thinks about orientalizing not as not inside the text, not as a language, Aladdin's lamp, genies, etc., but with these images. And so I use this as my poster because it's so disturbing. They're all hideous caricatures, and they're almost all white faces, it appears. Perhaps one not, but mostly white faces. And you'll see there are different descriptions. One of them I'm going to come back to is the one man dot unwholesome fish belly skin. He's talking about different shades of whiteness. So here's the, let me move to so you can see the page. This follows that illustration, and I'll show you on the next page what it looks like. But he goes, this is in just before the next page. Twain sees from his window, so the slide, that one is called Passers-by. Okay? Twain sees from his window yet another in London, yet another occulted, so defamiliarized, defamiliarized site on the London street. And it's the memory of so many black complexions from his pasts, the recent past in India, which he's just finished traveling through, and the global south, that's all along the equator, the other south long ago in his own US past. And this site makes the massed whiteness in front of him, which he's of course most used to, a nightmare. So here's the passage. Here's what it looks like but here, I'll just read, this is the passage. Then there would have been the added disadvantage of the white complexion. So he's thinking about really shades of complexion, not so much degrees of whiteness. See, it's not about blood. It's about what you can see visually. Blood is the 19th century term for biological race. Then there would have been the added disadvantage of the white complexion. It is not an unbearably unpleasant complexion when it keeps to itself, but when it comes into competition with masses of brown and black, the fact is betrayed that it is endurable only because we are used to it, only because it's familiar, we know it. Nearly all black and brown skins are beautiful, and just think about this. What position he's taking here, and it's not very comfortable necessarily. Nearly all black and brown skins are beautiful, but a beautiful white skin is rare. How rare, one may learn by walking down a street in Paris, New York, or London on a weekday, particularly an unfashionable street, so he's bringing in class a little bit there. And keeping count, he says, of the satisfactory complexions encountered in the course of a mile, where dark complexions are masked. They make the whites look bleached out, unwholesome. So, and there's the unwholesome fish belly skin, and sometimes, frankly, ghastly. I could notice this as a boy down south in the slavery days before the war. The splendid black satin skin of the South African Zulus of Durban seemed to me to come very close to perfection. I can see those Zulus yet. Handsome and intensely black creatures, moderately clothed in loose summer stuffs, whose snowy whiteness made the black all the blacker by contrast. Keeping that group in mind, I can compare those complexions with the white ones which are streaming past this London window now. bottom. And then you get the image on the next page. And then it goes further. There's a connection. We're back in the territory very quickly just to say whose skin is described as fish belly white, pap fins. We're back in that territory of Huck Finn. There's a description of in chapter 5 of Huck Finn. There weren't no color in his face, and remember, it's supposed to have been spoken by Huck Finn. There weren't no color in his face where his face showed. It was white, not like another man's white, but a white to make a body sick, a white to make a body's flesh crawl, a tree-toed white, a fish belly white. The racial component of caste here extends historically all the way from slavery to prejudice based on skin color. But of course, it's reversed. Whiteness is ghastly. Blackness is splendid. So here, back in England, the analogy between Indian caste and US race just explodes or implodes, either call it falling in on itself or exploding outward, turning upside down the US color hierarchy of whiteness and blackness. There's a connection that's not totally clear to me, and that's one thing I don't know that you can, that if it's easy enough to get this, but there's some connection that's not clear to me between the lavishly illustrated volume. A lot of the early ads, or the booksellers now, mention the incredible illustrations, somewhat like Connecticut Yankee, which was illustrated by Dan Beard. But here we've got Twain's most elaborately decorated book. So this is the booksellers now. But to try to show you, the illustrations are part of this book in a major way. Twain's most elaborately decorated book, illustrated with almost 200 lithographs, drawings, and photographs. The great photo of Twain sitting on deck with the caption, "Following the Equator." Another one was produced as here, a sumptuous volume with numerous illustrations by the best artists of the period. You get the idea. This branding of the book connects to its own themes of translation: textual and visual, India, US, at home and abroad, domestic and foreign, past and present, caste and race. And that whole set of connections ultimately end in failure of either historical comparison or of translation or even of intercommunication itself. So here, I just want you to get an idea. Here are some of the, Dan Beard, who was quite a radical, who illustrated Connecticut Yankee. Some of the medieval, one of the churchmen has the face of Jay Gould, the railroad baron. The Yankees' companion, Sandy, who's a page, has the face of Sarah Bernhardt in a sort of gender bending. And Dan Beard is one of those 11 artists who illustrated Following the Equator. So here, they're very satiric. They're very dark. Not all of them are like this. The illustrations, I wanted to give you, look at that. Chapter 1, there's one of the Dan Beards, and it's exactly like that, put at an angle for you, upside down. We started westward from New York in midsummer with Major Pond, who was the entrepreneur. This is that one. I just want you to see. They passed in review. All 200 illustrations have captions, and they're in the table of contents too. The White Man's Appliances, and you can see they're like cartoons. That was another very famous, it was a favorite form of popular media, political cartoons. So again, here's another one, The Usual Spirit. I mean, you get the idea, they're so dark. The Connecticut Yankee, they're funnier. But it's the same political concept. And then here's that one that I showed you earlier. This is not Dan Beard, it's Thomas Fogarty. Just to give you a sense, there are different styles of illustrations. in the book. So this is the last slide. So what does this all mean for the whole Caste project? What does it all add up to on the Caste front? So I would have, you're being so patient. I would have, in the longer version of this talk, talked a little bit about a sociologist named Oliver Cromwell Cox, who's from Trinidad, migrates to Chicago, and writes a very well-known book that was utterly ignored at its time called Caste, Class, and Race in 1948. I wanted to bring this sociologist and pair him with Twain as an outlier, someone who is reacting against the main dominant view of caste at his own time. Each one of those two, and I won't be able to do it, but I'm going to go to talk a little teeny bit about the history of caste. What does it show us when you suddenly see caste big in pop culture? But I would have said that Twain, in the 19th century, does something akin to what Cox does in 1948 in the mid-20th century in his view of caste. They both take their stand against the world of caste thinking at their own time. And they are writing in very different genres. That, Caste, Race, and Class is a 600-page work. Twain's Following the Equator is actually extremely long too, but they're different genres. Now, what I want to say is today's critical caste studies in academics is the inheritor of some of this work earlier, Twain's included. There is this scholarly counterpart to the caste abolition movement. Putting that present of ours in the context of the Oliver Cox history from the immediate post-war phase, 1930s and 40s, points to how the symmetries between caste and race, India and US, is still a hot button open question. And the symmetries meaning, do they really fit each other at all? And then again, this is why I mentioned most people have at least seen on a bestseller list Isabel Wilkerson's work called Caste, which was made into a film by Ava DuVernay. Wilkerson dismisses Cox as a contrarian, as someone who doesn't fit his own time because he was so much of an outlier, the way Twain is also a productive outlier. Only a very few in the history of this caste thinking in the US question whether the Indian caste system maps at all meaningfully onto race and its specific history in the United States, but across the Americas as well. The terminology of caste, which so heavily criticized in the 40s by Cox, again, whom Wilkerson dismisses as a contrarian, fell into disuse from the mid-1950s through the 1970s. This is like a thumbnail sketch of when did caste come to the fore in American culture. It fell into disuse after having been celebrated by the Chicago School of Sociology, other than by Cox. After that, it fell out of favor. It fell into disuse from the mid-1950s through the 70s, which was a period of advance for Black rights. No, surprisingly. But associating caste drops away when Black rights come to the fore. Caste thinking isn't necessary. Associating Black Americans, here's one way to put it, with a rigid millennia-old system like caste conflicted with the goals of the civil rights movement and of liberal integration, when the limits of that project, the civil rights movement, became apparent in the late 1960s, Black militants started systematically to compare their struggle to the worldwide anti-imperialist movements, which Twain is already doing in the 1890s, that were shaking off white rule and across the global South in Asia, Africa, and the Near East. Then the return of caste now in the 2010s up till our moment signal what I think you could say is another period of defeat. Who's for black rights, the rights of people of color, whose hallmark, that period of this 2010 to our present moment, has been the disproportionate incarceration of black people in the expanded penal system. The journalist Michelle Alexander calls it the new Jim Crow. Bringing back the notion of caste in the US reflected increasing pessimism about black futures, and I think does reflect increasing pessimism about black futures now at our moment. So I'm going to leave you with this speculative hypothesis. The odd couple of Twain and Cox, and I wish you could have seen more of Cox, but putting those two together, Cox as a 1948 theorist, Twain as an 1897 theorist, they together as an odd couple provide a possible preview of what we might hope to be the next phase in critical caste studies. It could or should take the lead from their insistence on unfixing the caste race analogy. Both of them advance unexpected, uneven, uncompleted, provisional, strange, open-ended, not prescriptive arguments. Everything that Twain wrote that we read is about the possible connection to the past. It's not prescriptive at all. Similarly, I think you could say that that tome, that sociological tome, which I use facetiously, that 600-page work of Cox's, is as possibly experimental in 1948 as following the equator, you can see really was experimental in 1897, under-recognized as such, but it was. We can look to their anomalous, understudied locations. Twain's multi-layered time travel, where is he? On the ship going in Calcutta, across the ocean, on the equatorial black belt. And we can look to Cox's Caribbean birth in Trinidad, although he emigrated to the United States when he was 19 and never went back. But the Caribbean as another strange, missing location in caste studies, both of them give us this X factor where it's not filled in the caste equals race equations. And I think I just want to read to you, this is really quickly, just because it's so wonderful. This is from a paratext. Cox's preface to this giant work, which starts in India and ends in the US. The last half of the book is called Race, and it's part 3, but it's half the whole book. It has been republished as a limited edition, abridged edition, in 1970. None of the other work of that period is well regarded at all. Here's what he says at the end of his preface. Many persons among the white, colored, and East Indian people of Trinidad have made my interviews not only a pleasure, but also a source of certain germinal ideas on race relations. Clearly, the social scientist should be accurate and objective, but not neutral. He should be passionately partisan in favor of the welfare of the people and against the interests of the few when they seem to submerge that welfare. In times of revolutionary social change, conclusions of even physical scientists may appear to have radical social consequences. That is a Twainian statement, if there ever was one. Not neutrality, but some kind of passion or humor. And let's hope that this odd couple may become better known for our moment now. And thank you for being so patient.